Για την υπομονή σας και σας ευχαριστώ για το ενδιαφέρον σας να έρθετε απόψε εδώ. Is there any English speaking in the audience so that I have to translate? I would like to welcome you all and welcome, of course, our special guest, Mr. Larry Cutler. Mr. Larry Cutler is the Chief Technical Officer and co-founder of the 9 times award-winning with an Emmy Award studios of animation, Baobab Studios, and he's going to give us a masterclass about the art of animation and many more, so we're really excited. But before giving the floor to Larry, I would like to introduce you and to give the floor to the regional governor of Central Macedonia, Mr. Apostolos Tzitzikostas, who is here with us today to say a few things about the Film Office.
Thank you very much, Larry. Welcome to Thessaloniki, Central Macedonia. It's a great honor to have you here with us. You should know that we are investing a lot in the efforts that you have been undertaking, and animation for us is something that we want to showcase, not only this exhibition beyond, but also in our region. Και να πω ότι το Film Office της Περιφέρειας Κεντρικής Μακεδονίας, που είναι το πρώτο Film Office στην Ελλάδα, το δημιουργήσαμε πριν από 4 χρόνια, όταν είδαμε πια ότι οι συνθήκες ήταν τέτοιες που θα μας επέτρεπαν να μεταφέρουμε και να δημιουργήσουμε εδώ στη Θεσσαλονίκη και την Κεντρική Μακεδονία ένα κέντρο για τις οπτικοακουστικές παραγωγές παγκόσμιο, και το καταφέραμε, δικαιώθηκε η επιλογή μας. Όπως ξέρετε, ήδη έχουμε 4 μεγάλες χολιγουντιανές ταινίες που έχουν γυριστεί, άλλες 2 προγραμματίζονται να ξεκινήσουν τον επόμενο μήνα, και βέβαια παράλληλα με τις μεγάλες αυτές παραγωγές θέλουμε να προβάλλουμε και τις δυνατότητες συνεργασίας σε τομείς όπως το animation, και γι' αυτό ζητήσαμε φέτος από τον κύριο Κάτλερ να είναι σήμερα κοντά μας, και μέσα από αυτή την προσπάθεια που κάνουμε από το Film Office, εκτός από όσα προσφέρουμε στις εταιρείες παραγωγής για να έρθουν εδώ και να δημιουργήσουν όχι μόνο ταινίες, αλλά και το post-production, αυτό που θέλουμε να κάνουμε επίσης είναι να δώσουμε τη δυνατότητα σε νέα μυαλά Έλληνες από την περιοχή μας, είτε στις νέες τεχνολογίες, την καινοτομία, είτε σε κλάδους και τομείς όπως το animation, αλλά είτε και στην κλασική παραγωγή οπτικοακουστικών μέσων. Άρα λοιπόν το Film Office είναι εδώ, είναι ένας σύμμαχος για κάθε δημιουργικό μυαλό στην περιοχή μας, και βέβαια θα συνεχίσουμε όλη η ομάδα του Film Office, ακόμη και αν μιλάνε μεταξύ τους όταν ξεκινάει μια εκδήλωση. Παρ' όλα αυτά είναι εδώ τα στελέχη μας για να στηρίξουν την προσπάθεια που κάνουμε. Έτσι δεν είναι, Αντώνη? Έτσι. Έχει και εμπειρία στο κομμάτι του animation, γι' αυτό τον αναφέρω, ειδικά τον Αντώνη. Λοιπόν, thank you again. It's been a pleasure to have you here today, and I'm really looking forward in continuing this collaboration that we have together. Likewise. Thank you very much. Thank you. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Thank you. All right. Can you all hear me? I think maybe the mic needs to be... Okay, sounds good. Maybe we can put it like that.
Okay.
Like that?
For the artists.
All right. Technical difficulties are always a fun way. It is really an honor and a privilege to be here today and to be able to talk to you a little bit about the art of animation, and especially some of the kind of insights and directions that I see happening in animation that I think are really exciting. So for me, I was very kind of lucky to start my career at Pixar and then later at DreamWorks working on computer animation, and I got to work on some of the early computer animated films at Pixar, and and later at DreamWorks, one of the things that is so exciting is that we get to kind of bring out the dreamer in each and every one of us. When you go to see a movie or when you're playing a great game, it allows you to be transformed and to sort of be with these characters and these worlds and these situations that are much kind of larger than our everyday life. And you get to think about, like, what would it be like to be this character? What would it be like to be in that situation? And that really was kind of the jumping off point for us founding Baobab Studios, which is the company that I currently work at. We started our company about 7 years ago. And it was a combination of myself, of our chief creative officer, Eric Darnell, who was the writer and director for the Madagascar films at DreamWorks, and also Maureen Fan, who was the head of games at Zynga, a social gaming company. So we were bringing together kind of expertise from the film side of the fence and the game side of the fence. And what excited us was this idea of what if we could actually place you directly inside of the story. So instead of watching up on a screen what these characters are going through, what if I'm in the world? What if I'm one of the characters that is actually riding on the back of a dragon or slaying demons or what have you? And that was really the impetus for starting our company. And the reason that we felt like it was the right time to do that was because there was this, not new medium, virtual reality had been around for 50 years, believe it or not. But a lot of the kind of problems that had led it to be only in the research labs were all of a sudden being solved, and there was this really promising Oculus Rift prototypes coming out, and we wanted to jump on that bandwagon and see if we could actually tell stories in a completely different way using virtual reality, and at the same time build upon our experiences and ultimately just be there to create great characters and stories that hopefully would transcend medium and not just be a great VR story, but something that we could tell more traditionally in TV, film, games, what have you. All right, so I'm gonna dive in and just talk about the power of storytelling in VR, and in immersive mediums. And what is fundamentally different about VR is that you are really connected with the world. Like, you are there, you're in the middle of everything, you're immersed, you can look anywhere. And the part that we learned, which actually we didn't realize going into this journey, was that we can actually give you a role to play. You can actually be a character in the story, and then we can actually inspire you to act if you choose to. It's not just watching something, but it is much more participatory. And then what's really cool is that because we have to render everything in real time, and it's everything, characters, the world are responding to what you do, the characters can actually acknowledge you, and they can actually build a relationship with you. So there can be just a connection that you build with a character that goes well beyond, sort of watching that up on the screen. And what that means is ultimately we can actually make you matter. And I think that that really is now part of our mission statement at Baobab, is that we can inspire you to dream, bring out your sense of wonder, and make you matter. And it's that last part that is really different from kind of the filmmaking and the creations that we've done in our previous jobs. So Baobab, over the last 6 or 7 years, we've developed 8 animated narrative projects in VR. And today, I'm gonna actually primarily take one of those, which is one of our most recent projects, Baba Yaga. Oops, I went ahead. Hold on. There we go, Baba Yaga. I'm gonna use that as kind of a basis for discussion. And I'm gonna actually walk you through the process that we go through to actually create one of these VR animated projects. And I'll try to highlight what is actually similar if we were to create this as a more traditional 2D project, as well as where it really deviates in terms of doing it for virtual reality. And I also just wanted to mention that Baba Yaga, we actually just signed last year a deal to turn Baba Yaga into a Disney Plus animated anthology series called The Witchverse. And the idea is that Disney's really excited about seeing a series of witches in each episode, and sort of having a presence of witches in the same way they do sort of fairy tales. So we're really excited about turning Baba Yaga into something that is available to everyone over the coming years. So that's something to look forward to. All right, so let's dive in. The first thing I wanted to talk about is story. And so in any project, if you take away one thing today, it's that story is the most important thing, and that doesn't change. Like building great stories with characters that are meaningful, that you care about, that you want to see go through this journey, that is fundamental to everything. And it doesn't matter, like all the new whiz-bang technology or what platform you're on. If you don't have a good story, then everything else kind of falls apart. And storytelling is something that has been around since since humans have been alive. This image is one of the first stories that was drawn on caves 14,000 years ago. So we have 14,000 years of storytelling in our DNA. Like story is really in our DNA. And in fact, if you think about feature films, cinema has been around for over 100 years. So we have this 100-year experience of how to tell stories in cinema. And it is really a fundamental part of who we are. And, in fact, storytelling actually affects our brain chemistry. So if you tell a story in kind of a 3-act structure, and you have Act 1 where you have an inciting incident that propels your characters on the journey, and Act 2 you have rising action. If you actually do that, then our body releases cortisol, or like stress hormones, like we're really tense with everyone. And then you have your climax and denouement, and if you do that properly, we actually release oxytocin, which is love hormone. And so telling stories in a very particular way is something that literally, when I say it's in our DNA, it's not figuratively, literally, like we are wired to actually release, like hormones and things that really, we respond to great storytelling. So how do we define a great story? And, there's no easy way to do it. You know it when you see it, right? So, one way of thinking about it is that it's all about eliciting an emotional experience through, and this word is something you'll hear a lot of, is through empathetic connections, empathy with the characters within the story. Now, Eric Darnell, our Chief Creative Officer, he really likes this way of thinking about things, and this is how we think about the story arc of our characters, is that a great story forces characters to make difficult choices under pressure, like the most difficult choices that they could ever make. And in doing so, it reveals something about their inner character. It reveals something about themselves that's really fundamental to who they are. And that, what it reveals, is completely unexpected to the audience. And yet, once it's revealed, it's completely inevitable. And so that is really how we think about the story progression and what a story, a character arc for our hero characters is, in order to have something that really has meaning and really like you feel that empathy for the characters. Now what's interesting is because you are part of the story, over time, Eric has really been thinking about what happens if you, as the hero character, have to make difficult choices under pressure that reveal something about yourself, as opposed to just watching someone go through that. And so that's something we've been playing with in terms of, and especially in Baba Yaga, you actually have a difficult choice to make at the very end of the piece. And Baba Yaga, I should have introduced Baba Yaga. Baba Yaga is it's an Eastern European folktale, and it's been told in 1,000 different ways. And if you start reading different versions of Baba Yaga, what you'll notice is that they're all different. And so the sort of typical Baba Yaga is a witch that rides around on a mortar with a pestle, and she basically steals little boys and girls and eats them, like puts them in her pot. So pretty grim stuff. But in some versions, she's actually not necessarily good or evil. It's more transactional, like you do something for me, I'll do something for you. And then in other versions, Baba Yaga is actually a force for good and a protector of the environment and nature. And so Eric's key insight, he was really fascinated with why are there so many different versions of the Baba Yaga fairy tale. And so his insight was that Baba Yaga is not a person, but Baba Yaga is a role. And so in our version of Baba Yaga, that's the jumping off point, where at the end of the experience, you have to go into the forest to bring back a magical like a magical flower that can save your mother. And you, of course, end up having to confront Baba Yaga. But at the very end, from the first time we started thinking about it, the thing we were excited about is that at the end, you have a choice of whether you want to put on Baba Yaga's mask and become the next Baba Yaga. And if you do, what type of witch are you going to be? Are you going to be a witch that is in harmony with the humans? Or are you going to be a witch that actually uses her power to protect against the humans and sort of become all more powerful? So are you going to be a good witch or an evil witch, I guess is the reductionist version of that. So anyway, I should have given you that brief introduction ahead of time. All right, so this slide relates to when I said if you take one thing away. And I wanted to talk a bit about the relationship of art and science. So my background is actually technical. I studied computer science and computer graphics. And then when I went to work at Pixar, they brought together all these really, really bright, like technical people and these really, really amazing creative people who all went to art school and studied animation and drawing and had never used a computer before, and they all threw us together. And we had to learn how to speak together and how to actually make films together. And so there was an incredible collaboration between art and science. And I've noticed that the most successful both films that have been that I've worked on and the most successful software projects and development that we've done have been when there's a really nice synergy between art and science. But at the same time, the most important thing, the thing that drives everything, is story. And so art and science are only interesting when they're in service of the story. And so I think that is a key takeaway, is that you could have like the best technology and like take VR. If you just focus on a tech demo of showing off what is powerful about VR without story, then over time, it's like not very interesting. And similarly, if you have the most artistic, beautiful thing, but there's not a story, then you're going to lose your audience. And so the story drives everything that we do. It drives our choices about where we actually innovate. It drives our choices about what is our artistic look. And that ends up being our North Star. And that especially is important when you're in a new medium, when you're doing something you haven't done before, because it's very easy to be seduced by, like trying to showcase, like what's amazing about hand controllers or or it's very seductive to really get bought into something that's so artistically beautiful, but it needs to be in service of the story. So that if there's one thing to take away, it's the power of storytelling and how that should drive all the projects that you do. All right, so just to kind of walk through our process, we start out with a story, and Eric, or our director and writer, is pitching the story and getting feedback and getting excited about it. One of the first things that we do, even in a VR project, is we actually put pen to paper and we actually write a script. And so at our different creators are very different, but at our studio, we actually, like, the script is actually an important part of things, and writing is really an important part of our process. So we're always kind of keeping the script up to date with any changes that we make, even really far down the process. Now, one interesting thing when you get into the story is that, as I said before, we've actually started making you a character in the story. And so this is just a quick video from our first project, Invasion, which you actually are, it's about like two aliens who tried to take over the world, but they're thwarted by cute little bunny Chloe, which you see right here. But you're actually a bunny in the scene as well. And when we actually made you a bunny, all of a sudden people had this strong connection to Chloe in a way that they didn't before. And so with each of our projects, we are really focused on what is your role in the story, and that becomes part of the script process and the story process from a very early point of view. And so our writer and director for a project is actually tracing your arc through the story in the same way that they might trace the other hero characters or the other characters in the story. All right, that also leads into character design. And character design is one of the most fun parts because it's where you actually, the heart of your story is your characters. And you have these amazing artists who actually realize them. And so I'm just going to show you some of the character designs for our characters in Baba Yaga. So this is our Baba Yaga character. These are some early concept work that we have. You could see here at some point we actually transplanted Baba Yaga out of Eastern European mythology and put it originally on like a Caribbean island. Eventually it became like on an unknown island, and we were exploring things that I think had a more Caribbean tone to them. That actually went away, but you could see that influence here in some of these early designs, like the crazy masks. And by the way, this is more aligned. This was the final, and then these are some of the earlier sketches. And then this is our hero character, Magda. So Magda, you're Sasha in the story, and Magda is your younger sister, and she's the one who you go together on this journey. And so these are character designs for Magda. And these are we often do a lot of pose expressions, so expression seats. So again, this part is very traditional, the same way you do in any animated project. And these are some earlier designs. And again, you can also see that kind of Caribbean influence in some of the earlier designs. And then you also start working on concept art for, what is this project going to look like? What are the worlds and the environments going to look like? So this is actually in Baba's lair. This is one of the first concept pieces that was done for the project. I should mention that the other part of Baba Yaga is that Baba Yaga goes around on a house that's built on top of chicken legs. So you can see the house and then chicken legs, and then you'll see how that evolved. And this is some early concept. One of the things that we did in Baba Yaga is we put it on at the beginning and the end, we have like a 3D pop-up book feel, where how like pop-up books have like a bunch of 2D pop-ups, but we could do it all around you, like surround you in the world. These are some environment paintings. All right, so that's some early artwork. Once we actually have a script, the next part of things is storyboarding. And so storyboarding is, also part of the heart and soul of fleshing out the story in any animated project. And even in VR, where the storyboards really don't correspond to what you're going to see in 3D, we do actually start with storyboards. And in fact, our first project, Invasion, we actually were like, well, we're doing it in VR, we don't need storyboards. And it was a huge mistake because we had no kind of vision for the like what was going on, and we couldn't articulate from Eric, because storyboards are used to both be able to evaluate the story, but they're also used later on to actually as a blueprint for production. And so we got neither of those, and we ended up having to iterate a lot in animation, which is just really, really expensive and really, like not time effective. Neither time nor cost effective. So these are actual storyboards for another project of ours, but I just wanted to kind of show you, like sort of a vein of some storyboards. Okay, so this is where things really veer off from a traditional animated project, is because you are and you have a role to play in the story, then there's a lot of interactivity, because you can actually, suddenly a character is responding to you, or you can actually press buttons, or you can reach out and pet a character. So you influence how things are how the story is told. And so there's an interactive design that starts getting developed, and the way that games work, because we basically, the interactivity is very, is fundamental to games. And so the way that games work is you start out with the interactivity, and specifically with the core mechanic. So the core mechanic is like, what am I gonna do? So like on one of our projects, Crow the Legend, the idea was that you have, your hands are like branches and things come out of your hands. So the core mechanic is waving my hands. And so then you would prototype that, where you basically are like, okay, let's actually have a bunch of prototypes of how am I gonna wave my hands? How is it gonna interact with the world? And from a game's perspective, you don't do anything until you have a mechanic that's fun and enjoyable and works, and you've user tested that. And so games people would be like, why are we developing a story if we don't have a core mechanic? Now film people would be like, what's a core mechanic? Why do I care about that? The most important thing is my storyboards. What we learned the hard way by doing it wrong a bunch of times is that we need to be able to do both early on. The core mechanic and who you are influence massively the story you're telling, and vice versa. The story is super important to the core mechanics. So we actually do this interactive design and prototyping very early on in the process while we're developing the story. And so then in that way, we're getting their interactivity team together with our story team, and they're working closely together. All right, and I just wanted to emphasize that this leads very quickly, as I said, because there's interactivity, to very non-linear stories. Like if you think about traditional animation is very time-based, very meticulous. Every frame is planned out, and an animator is working very hard, and all the artists and technical people are supporting that to really tell and to really show a moment to moment, and then sort of beat to beat, and then act to act, and scene to scene. But that completely changes. And so this is an example. Now, we do have some sound problems, so this may be hard to hear. I'm going to put a microphone next to my thing, but this is one of the things that can happen once you actually introduce autonomy, and you could be part of this story.
Hello, Scout 817. Hey, I'm talking here. Oh, if you'd let me finish. Oh. You do realize that I'm programmed to feel pain, right? Oh.
So what happens when, first of all, if I have a log and I have a fire and I put the log in the fire, well, it better catch on fire. And then as you see in here, what happens, this is the first line of dialogue that this helper robot's trying to say, Debbie. She's trying to tell you information. What happens if I throw a burning log at Debbie? Well, she better respond. And so you can see how having this type of interaction is way more complicated than if you actually are just sort of linearly going through things. And so one of the ways that we approach this is we actually took a nod from stand-up comedy, of all things, where stand-up comedians, it turns out they don't just sort of get up on stage and tell a bunch of jokes and are funny. They really plan out their sets, and they're always trying new material. And the way that they organize their performances is they have like a set, which is kind of a big chunk of their of what they're going to do, and then they break that into chunks, which are, you could think of like themes, like sort of sections, and those chunks can be rearranged. You could throw one out, and similarly, each chunk is set up in individual bits, which are individual jokes, and the individual jokes can be also rearranged, and I can tell them in different order. I can only tell 3 out of the 5 of them. And so this is a very flexible system, and it changes based on audience participation. And that's exactly what we have. So we basically encode the highest levels of our story using this kind of chunks and bits metaphor. And that actually makes its way into the script. So if we need a ton of dialogue of, like, what does Debbie do when you throw log editor that actually is in the script, and we record the actors and actresses. That makes its way into the interactive design. And then we actually built an entire framework and system for how you actually, sort of encode that in the interactivity in our game engine, which, just so you know, we use Unity for building all of these projects that we do. And so this is an example from Baba Yaga of Magda handing you a lantern, which seems actually really simple, but in fact is actually really complicated because she has to come up to you wherever you are. You could be anywhere. And then what happens if you take the lantern with different hands? What happens if you don't take the lantern? How do you grab the lantern? There's a lot of complexity that goes in. But you can see here that the highest level of that complexity or the lower levels are abstracted away from you. And so an interactivity person's dealing with that. But then the highest level of plugging this all together is handled through our storyteller platform. So, all right, so that gives you a sense of things. Now I'm going to get into more of the production part of things, which is you end up with a series of scenes, and you actually want to translate that from these storyboards into the 3D world. And so previs, historically, if you think of a traditional animated film, previs is the part where you're actually placing your cameras and you're actually placing your characters and the objects in the world and making sure that you have coverage. And really, that's the first time that you're seeing the entire scene in 3D. Now, in VR, we've tried a bunch of different things because previs can be really important when our projects are more linear and more narrative. And it can also not be the most useful thing when they're more interactive. So we've done more traditional previs in some cases. We've also done a lot of work on VR storyboarding in some cases as well, where we're actually doing the storyboards in VR, or we're placing 2D storyboards in VR and getting that early indication of things. So we've tried a lot of different things of how you previs stuff for virtual reality, where things are in 360 degrees. So this is a previs from one of our projects, Crow the Legend, which was based off of a Native American legend, from a variety of different Native American tribes that kind of tells the story of how the crow became the crow, and which is a very typical kind of indigenous storytelling, or worldview. And so I'm going to play this, and what you could see is the storyboards up on the top right, and then the previs that we have on the for most of the frame. And I'll hopefully you can hear this.
I am so cold. Look, what's that?
Hey, everybody, look at me. I did not fly into the sun.
Mom, you're okay.
Easy, easy. Hey. Whoa, hey, now that is a fire, huh?
What were you thinking?
Oh, man, you should have seen Crow. He was like, wait, where'd he go? There's your fire.
Crow.
And what happened to his voice?
Crow, dude, your feathers, they're all like completely messed up, man.
Turtle. Crow, are you okay?
All right, it gives you a sense of it. Here's actually an example from the project with Debbie that I just showed. And this is an example where we actually did previs as VR storyboards with a little bit of interactivity. So you could just sort of see, this is what the person's seeing in the headset. But there was also some interactivity in as well. So this is an example where we were trying to incorporate storyboards, but also it was a much more interactive project, so we were incorporating the interactivity very early on in the process. All right, so the next part of the project, and this is something that is actually much more game focused, is we do a vertical slice. And so the vertical slice is where you take one section of your project. So like you can think of it as one scene. In a game, it'd be one level typically. And you basically are going to take it all the way to like final look, as well as all of the interactivity figured out. And so the idea is this is where you prove out that you can actually build this thing. And you all of a sudden are getting a sense of, wow, like how much effort is it going to be to actually do the rest of the project? So this is an example from Bonfire. And basically Bonfire is a project where you have to, you're stranded on an alien planet, and you of course are the alien on this planet. And so this little cute creature, Pork Bun, you have to befriend Pork Bun. So you have to build up trust with Pork Bun. So this is an example of a vertical slice where you're interacting with Pork Bun. And so the reason for this project that we chose this section was because all of the complexity of the interactivity was built into this section. And I should say that I'm cheating here because, in fact, when we finished the vertical slice, the interactivity didn't work very well. And it ended up being the last thing that we completed on the project. So, so sometimes your ambitions are much higher than, like the amount of time you have allotted. So next I'm going to get to the, the fun part, animation. So, we're very lucky to have a lot of really talented animators, and we start exploring the character personalities really early on. So this is actually a piece of 2D animation from that character Pork Bun that we could do before we actually have modeled and rigged the characters at all. And this is just really us trying to understand Pork Bun's personality. So this is an early design from one of the first characters that we did on our first project, Invasion. And so this is a cute little bunny named Chloe, and we really wanted to make sure that we could actually get an empathetic character and an empathetic character performance from Chloe. And at the time when we started working in VR, we didn't see any of that. Like all of the models were super polygonal and low res, and the animation, like there was no, like you couldn't really feel that illusion of life that the, like a character's thinking or looking at you. And so we set to prove that out. And so we ended up like dissecting what makes, like a character animation, what's gonna make that performance really come to life. And for us, the fleshiness of Chloe and the fleshiness of the characters was really important. So we wanted to have subdivision surfaces, which is very common in feature film projects or in any film projects, but really hard to do in games because it's actually just too expensive render-wise. And so we ended up building some technology to support that. We wanted complicated deformations. We wanted to really feel the facial expressions. So we wanted to use some of the deformation techniques that we were used to on the rigging side from feature films in our games. And we actually are always creating a stylized version of reality. That's what excites us, is to not necessarily try to recreate photoreal characters or realistic characters, but ones that are actually quite stylized. And one of the ways that we do that is really exaggerated poses, like you could see with these alien characters on the left, and having lots of squash and stretch and things like that, which are just also hard to do in games. And of course, the biggest thing is all of this needed to be interactive. All needed to run in real time. So this is an example from the project of the results. And these are actually some other characters as well. So hopefully you can see that, in our projects, that connection that you have with the characters really, does come to life. And just to remind everyone, all of the things that I just showed you, all of those were rendered at 72 frames a second on like a mobile phone, basically, like on a mobile headset. So, for us being able to feel like you have that same quality as a feature film in the animation, but with the constraints of it having to be rendered really, really fast was important to us. And so this is from Baba Yaga. This is actually one of the scenes just focusing on the animation. So I just want you to take a look at, this was the inciting incident for the scene, which is that your mother is really sick. Magda's like, hey, we could go get this witch blossom. And she's like, no, that's not real. Don't go into the forest. It's too dangerous. And of course, Magda goes and you follow her. And so she's going to offer you the lantern, which is really offering you to join her on that journey. I think I have the sound turned off here just so you could kind of focus on the animation. Now, if that's what an animator would typically see. So that I think that render was still in a VR headset, but with all the lighting turned off. But that, you know, is very typical where you're not focused on where the light's coming from or all the fancy like effects or anything, but that's just the pure animation. But what's really exciting is when you get to actually add in all the final elements. And so for all of, I don't know how many of you are lighters or have done lighting on animated projects, but in a film, you get to really meticulously craft the lighting. Or, you know, in a live action project as well, where not only are you able to light the world around you, but you can have really tight rim lights and, you know, like sort of a number of lights that are on the characters, and you can adjust it per shot. Well, you can't do that in VR because you could be anywhere. And so you can walk through, and on top of that, lights that cast shadows are really expensive. And so you can only have one light that casts shadows typically. And so your lighting has to be really robust and sort of, you know, so you basically end up having, first of all, one lighting setup or, you know, a couple lighting setups that you might blend between. And then there's a lot of techniques to actually optimize so that any lights that don't move, you can actually pre-bake them. So there's just a lot of technical complexity that's very different than a film. So I just wanted to highlight that the lighting is actually, you know, much more challenging to get that same level of quality that you get from a shot where you're, you know, like you know exactly where the viewer's looking and you can adjust the lighting for that individual shot. Because I'm the camera, I could be anywhere in the scene. So this is the same scene, but with the final lighting and rendering. And this does have sound.
Sasha. Did you follow me? I refuse to go back until I find that witch blossom. So you can just return to the village on your own. Or you can carry the lantern and come with me. Thank you.
And the reason I chose that piece of animation, just so you know, is there's a lot of subtlety in that performance. And although, like, I love animation that's really broad, I think, you know, what really gives heart to a project is when you have those really subtle moments and really strong character performances. In fact, our director, Eric, he liked to say that that Magda always exhibits courage, which is, courage is not necessarily being, you know, like being scared, but it's, or like, you know, facing something really difficult. It's actually like being scared of it and doing it anyway. And so, you know, that ended up being a really, you know, sort of, that courage ended up being something that was in everything that Magda did. And so, you know, again, that's an example where the personality of the characters is something that Eric's always hitting home in our projects with the animators. So everything kind of emanates from where they are in their character journey. All right.
We've got to get out of here.
Oh wait, hold on. Hold on. No, that's that. Okay.
We've got to get
Okay, so this is some more animation of Magda.
Here she comes.
Do you know the punishment for thievery?
become the witch. Now go. Run as fast as you can.
All right. Now, one of the interesting things is that we actually are creating a VR project, but in a lot of cases, we actually will also create a 2D film version as well. And that's because we want people to be able to see our pieces to as broad an audience as possible. And as much as I love VR, it's still a really small community of people who actually have VR headsets. And so that creates especially interesting challenges of how do you actually create a 2D film from the same source material as your VR project, because we don't have the time or the money to like redo the whole thing. And so one of the things that I felt was so interesting on Baba Yaga is that our Eric Darnell, who is our writer and director on the project, he wanted to do the cinematography himself, because we wanted to actually make it feel like, even though, like, because you're part of the story, we wanted it to feel that you were still part of the story in the 2D version. And so we actually shot all of the cameras, or Eric shot all of the cameras in VR. So this is an example where we're using VR as the medium to actually shoot all the cinematography. And we built up an entire tool set for him to shoot the cameras. And so the thing that's really amazing about it is not like that has been done before, but it's that our key creative is actually the one doing the work, because of it being in VR and the sort of intuitiveness of it. And that would really never be able to happen, or I'd never expected that to happen. So this is actually a shot of Eric basically doing the photo, the video shoot from the comfort of his own home. This was done during the pandemic. So what you're seeing is Eric, what on the upper right is what Eric's seeing. And so he's, shooting a virtual camera. And then this is the final footage. And so Eric could, do a bunch of different takes. We would create a bunch of different cameras. He would actually tweak them. And then we would send that off to an editor and do a cut. And then we would rinse and repeat that process. And we kind of had this whole tool set up so that, our cinematographer, our creative, didn't need engineers, working around the clock to help them out. All right. This is actually just a little clip from one of our most recent projects, NAMU, which stands for tree in Korean. And so NAMU, what is powerful about this film is it's basically a VR narrative poem that tells a story of a man's life from birth to death in 10 minutes as represented through that tree. And it was shortlisted for Oscar consideration. And I'm going to touch upon what was so neat in just a second, which is I just wanted to leave you before we get into the Q&A with some future directions and some of the things that I think are really exciting. And so some of these things are the things that we've been working on, which is real time. You probably heard a lot of, between Unity and Unreal, all the work that we're doing is really going to transform not just, animation in VR, but is also transforming how we actually create traditional animation. Because the ability to actually have everything happening in interactive rates means that you can actually iterate really quickly. You can actually have a session with the director where they can see the results immediately, which is incredibly powerful. Obviously, immersive technologies like VR change the way we can tell stories. They also change our process, like you just saw with how we created the 2D film. And then there's just a lot of AI is reaching a point where it's actually fueling our creativity. I'll just touch on some of these things. So first of all, you just saw Namu. What I didn't say, that entire project was created in VR. Pretty crazy. So we did all of the animation, everything was done in a program called Quill, which was an artistic tool originally and then incorporated animation. And so a team of less than 10 artists, no engineers, actually created that entire film in VR. So all of it was done in headset. Here are some interesting things from the AI side of things. So this is an example from Roblox. So this is, you take a video of yourself with your phone, you send it off to cloud computer, and then it spits back an animation. And that animation can then be applied to all the characters in Roblox. And so what's cool about this isn't that, like, I've seen lots of demos in the research communities in SIGGRAPH, but this is like mainstream where, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of independent artists, not like big studios, are actually able to, without mocap or all like fancy equipment, they're able to just video themselves and get an animation clip back. And in the Roblox community, in case you didn't know this, it's all primarily kids under the age of 13. And so a lot of the creators are really young, aspiring, like game creators who are not animators. They don't, like they're not like all of you. And they're able now to get going in a, like get these animation clips really easily. And so I think that that's really interesting. I just saw this is just like in the last couple of weeks, by the way. Another interesting thing that is kind of running through my studio right now is kind of AI generative art. And so for those of you who haven't used Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, DALL-E, there's a few different flavors of this. What happens is you type in a little expression. So this one is exuberant cat jumping in the style of, and then you fill in your favorite artist, and it spits out images. The AI spits out images that are really interesting. And our, Eric has been fascinated by this. So he started using this as early inspiration, and it's, because he's our chief creative officer, that's got like all of us playing around with it. And so this is not going to replace art, but it is allowing people to get really, there's some really amazing art that's being generated. If you go onto any of these forums for these projects, you'll see some just amazing art. But for our studio, we're actually starting to think about how can we use this just to give us inspiration. Like typically, when we start visual development, we might send off a number of different artists to go and gather, sort of mood boards and gather art. And here we actually can, this is one of the tools that we can use, which I just think is really, really exciting. All right, and I just wanted to end, here's my closing on this, which is, this is actually a phrase, Metakwe Oyasin, which with the project Crow the Legend, we worked a lot with the indigenous communities in the United States and in North America. And because it's a story that's, we wanted to make sure we told that as authentically as possible and from an indigenous worldview. And so this is a phrase from the Lakota tribe in North America. And what it translates to roughly is we are all connected, we are all one. And that is, a very strong indigenous view of that we are all part of this earth, and we are on equal footing with the environment around us, with the crow, with the stars, and so that we are all connected really is I think a great life view right now, one that we need more of. But it is also a great summation of the promise of VR. Because in VR, you are connected to the world around you. You are part of that world, and that leads to a fundamentally different way of thinking about narrative storytelling. And so I think this is just a great way to kind of summarize the promise of VR. So I just wanted to thank all of you, and yeah.
Thank you, Larry. It was really immersive and inspiring speech. I think you will all agree with me. So I would like to give the floor to our speakers with Larry, who will facilitate the discussion. And I would like to address a big thanks to the New Media Lab of the Department of Visual and Applied Arts of the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, as well as the other departments of the Aristotle University in Thessaloniki, who are here with us today and who honor with their presence this masterclass. So I would like to call Fani Boudouroglou, a visual artist and a special teaching staff to the new lab department. She will facilitate the talk together with Dimitris Avaidis. Dimitris is an acclaimed Greek designer of animation, and he's a general manager and what else? And producer of Number 9 company. He knows very well the animation landscape and the visual arts landscape in Greece. So the floor is yours, and I would like to encourage you to ask questions and to be immersive and interactive with this masterclass. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you so much. It was a really inspiring speech and masterclass. You pretty much covered most of my questions, but I have some more. So one question that I would like to ask you is about the future of immersive technologies. Do you think we will have even more multisensorial immersive technologies? Will we experience more a VR theater type environment where haptics and smell will contribute in even more immersive experience? And how close do you think we are in a scenario like that?
No, that's a great question. So my hope is that the VR community and sort of the VR adoption is still not mainstream. So there's probably a small number of millions of headsets that are being used on a regular basis. And obviously what we'd like that to be is tens of millions or hundreds of millions. So there's a ways to go. At the same time, the adoption and the sales of the Oculus Quest are actually quite robust. So there is positive movement with regards to that, and Sony's coming out with next generation PlayStation. Apple's going to come out with a headset at some point. We keep hearing some point soon. So I do think that there's going to be accelerated growth over the next several years. There's still a lot of work to be done in terms of the ergonomics of it, in terms of fidelity, to make it something that is a must-have. And at the same time, it's really about like the applications. What are the things that are going to draw you where you have to come back to VR day in and day out. And so we, of course, hope to be part of the solution there. And and I am so excited. My hope is that we inspire other people to develop for this medium. And it's really nascent and really early. And that's one of the things that's exciting about it is that you have the opportunity to build something that's completely hasn't been done before. And that means that you can break rules. It means that, you can be part of a growing community, which I think is great. Now, in terms of the other thing about more, VR theaters and more events that capture smell and haptics, and I think there's definitely a place for that as well. And in fact, there has been a lot of VR theaters that have been building up. Obviously, the pandemic has changed that too, where experiences like The Void, which I think were great, so they had like a Ghostbusters experience and a Star Wars experience where you and your friends actually are going on a journey together that is both you get to shoot down stormtroopers, but there's a story associated with it, is really compelling. But unfortunately, with the pandemic, all of that shut down, and and has also meant a lot of early stage companies like The Void are no longer in existence or in a much smaller footprint than they once were. So I think, but I do think the promise of that is equally exciting. Most of our projects, we've always tried to be for as broad an audience within VR as possible. And so we've shied away from, even though our stuff would be great as a Void-like experience, we've shied away from doing things that are only work in a large scale setup just because it doesn't scale very well. That being said, one of our projects was called Jack, and it is a story of Jack and the Beanstalk, and we showcased that at Tribeca Film Festival, and that was one where you're going through this experience as Jack, and then all of the other characters were live actors who are improvising based on what you say, and then they're mocapped, and so then you're seeing the characters, not like the mocap actors, and then all of the set pieces. So if you have a glass, there's actually a physical object mapped directly to the virtual one, and the performance was so compelling because you're getting live actors performing, you're getting that tactile feedback from the objects around you and the matching in the virtual world. So I think those experiences are amazing. I think the challenge, of course, is just an economic one of how much our business person at one point is it's a real estate problem, but I don't understand that. So, but I know there are economic issues to deal with on that. But I think there's going to be a great place for that in the future as well.
Okay, and one more question, and then I will give it to Dimitris. So the fact that you are actually building a brand new cinematic language is a great challenge, isn't it, for VR content? So that brings you back to are there any similarities in between the early days of where you were exploring computer animation to what you're exploring now in the not so early anymore days of VR? Do you face similar challenges?
Yeah, and I think that's a great analogy. So when I started my career, I started it at Pixar right around the time that Toy Story had come out. So they had just released Toy Story, and then they're like, oh my God, we need to do more of these projects. So we need to, hire a bunch of young people. And in those early days, there was something really magical because we didn't know what we were doing. So everything we were working on hadn't been done before in CG. And, we were also changing minds about how you could tell an animated story because it had been hand-drawn for, almost 80 plus years in a certain way by one company. And so there was just something really exciting and everyone who we were working with was there not for monetary gain, but because we actually were passionate about telling animated stories in different ways and breaking boundaries. And so over time, the making animated films, we got pretty good at that. So the story part was always hard, but we actually understood all the parts of the process, and it became much more about efficiency and if we're going to invest $100 million, we better do it as efficiently as possible. And so the types of things we were doing were just different set of challenges. And so what's been great about Baobab is that suddenly we're back in that world where everything is brand new. And it's actually even more extreme than the early days at Pixar because there was still that foundation of we're making a film, we can build upon that. With here, we we really learned very quickly that VR is very different from film. It really is like a new medium because, you know, like all of the things that you deal with cinematography, like they don't translate at all. You know, like you are the camera. If you try to move the camera and you don't put a lot of care into it, you're going to make someone sick. And so it really forced us, you know, each and every day to kind of, you know, have to think through and problem solve. And, you know, but I think that that's been what's been exciting. And, you know, everyone who comes to work at Baobab has to have that shared vision and excitement. You know, that we had a lot of people early on who came in, let's say, who were games people, and they really just wanted to make a game, or a film person who really just wants to make the high-end, you know, sort of visuals. And what we were doing was not either of those. And so we needed people who had that shared vision. You know, and that's the passion that everyone brings to the table every day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So yeah, me, what? I want to ask you one question, which is, I think, important, because in VR, you cannot direct, you can direct the attention of who is viewing. So how do you keep the viewer's attention where you want it in order to follow the story?
No, that's a great question as well. So, you know, Eric, as the director for many of our early projects, would say that his job as the director, you know, people would say like, hey, how does it feel to give up that direct, like you can't control where people look? And he's like, no, my job is, even though you can look anywhere in the screen, it's to actually compel you to look at the right place at the right time, even though you can look anywhere. Now the question is how do you do that? Like, we've gotten really good at getting you to look at the right place in a rectangular box over the last 100 years. And there's lots of techniques. And so we had to really reinvent those. And so an example, you know, like there's no tried and true things, but some of the things we've learned, you know, one is the power of eye contact. And you know, like a magician is really good at eye contact. So, and using eye contact to direct or misdirect the viewer. And so kind of the two rules for magicians are, one, if you want someone to look at you, you look at them. So if I'm looking right at you, you're gonna look back at me. And then once I have your eye contact, if I want you to look up over here, if I look up over here, you're gonna follow me. And, you know, then I pull something out of, you know, with my other hand. And so in Invasion, we really started using eye contact as a primary means to direct your eye. So for example, at the very beginning of Invasion, Chloe hops up to you. She looks you directly in the eye. She's in your personal space, and everyone is looking right at Chloe at that point. Like, you're connected with her, especially because you're there. Then Chloe looks up at the sky because she hears something. And then everyone looks up at the sky. And then at that point, we have you looking in that direction. And so then we could start using some of the more traditional things. So we're trying to get you to look at a spaceship. And so the spaceship's coming, and then we can actually have a dark spaceship on a white background framed by two mountains. And so there we're using traditional framing techniques to get you to see the spaceship. And in fact, that getting people to see the spaceship was the hardest thing that happened in Invasion. People would always miss the spaceship. And we tried a lot of things with sound, because you have, you know, control over the 3D sound, which is really amazing. But we tried more traditional things where we're like, okay, we'll foreshadow, you know, we'll start the sound soft and foreshadow. And what would happen is people would look up early because they heard the initial sound. And then as it got bigger, they're like, oh, I don't see anything. And so you start looking around, and then they'd miss the spaceship. So we also had to use sound in a different way than you would do on a film. So, you know, that's just one example. We've, over time, kind of developed a number of ways that we can kind of get you to look at things. But I would say eye contact is really a big one that we, you know, have been playing with in each of our projects.
Okay. So, who would like to place a question, to ask a question to Larry? Come on. Naso? Come on, don't be shy. Hey, Socrates.
Do you have any tips or things to look out for someone that wants to study CG and eventually have like a career in CG or animation in general?
All right. That's a great question, and I think the biggest piece of advice is to just go for it and do it and actually get experience. You know, like what's great today is that all the tools that you need to create animation are at your disposal. You know, and for students, they're all free. So Maya, you can use to do animation. Houdini, you know, on the real-time side, both Unity and Unreal. So you actually have the animation tool sets at your disposal. And I would just say that that's the best piece of advice is to like actually make stuff. I think depending on what type of career you'd like to have in animation, you know, I think for animators, one piece of advice is to really have a strong background in drawing and animation, and you don't necessarily need to be like the most computer savvy person in the world, but having that, you know, sort of deep background in drawing is really helpful. In fact, you know, even though my background's on the technical side, if there's one thing I could do over, I would have, you know, like taken more drawing classes. I ended up doing a lot of that. You know, at Pixar, they offered a lot of drawing classes, but it's much harder to learn as an adult. So I think that's the biggest advice is that you really can dive in, you know, like right now. There's not anything preventing you from doing that, and so I would go for it.
Can I answer also? From the Greek reality perspective. So, what you said is exactly right. I have a saying in Greek that I don't know if I'm allowed to use here, maybe. It's called να έχεις τη μέλισσα στον κόλο σου, meaning not to sit down and to do stuff in generally, and to present yourself into production and into anything. You can start even as a runner. It's a position, so you can understand the pipeline, so you can understand how this big team, because it's a huge team and parts of animation, how does it work and where do you fit in? Where's your skills, your heart, and your everything fits in a production? You can be a storyboarder, you can be a modeler, you can be a rigger, you can be a lighter. There's tons and tons of placements that can go in animation production. So where do you feel that you belong? Then you go in after you vision the whole pipeline and you see what's happening. We are used here in Greece in one-man band, but that's not what's happening really in an animation production. You need the skills and you need everything, but also you need to figure out where's your heart, and then go in. I'm talking because I have a studio here, and it's a 2D studio, not 3D, and we do series for Disney and Fox. We're doing backgrounds for a Finnish series and scripts for a Japanese one. And now I'm a GM and producer in a studio in Athens that we will do a huge 3D series, and we're looking constantly for people. I mean, it's a thriving industry, and we will need people like you, so get ready.
Actually, I just wanted to follow up to be bold in terms of both asking for advice and help. Like, one of the things I've actually learned from my co-founder and our CEO is that she has a ton of advisors. So she is willing to go up to people that are her heroes and be like, hey, would you actually be willing to give me advice or to be my advisor? And more often than not, if you actually find those people and like they're often really flattering and really willing to actually, connect you with the right people to kind of get that first break or, or to help you along in your career. And so it's something I didn't realize the power of that. But ultimately building those connections so that you can find, like the jobs and you can find the advice that you need to get. I do think it is also a good point that the industry has become more specialized. And so I think originally it's like people could do, like all of the animation and lighting and everything themselves. And so I always hate to say this because I like being a generalist, but the more that if you know there's a certain part of the process that you like, being able to be really good at that, could go a long way. The other thing though is maybe I was getting at this is especially if you want to tell stories and direct something, you can actually build up your own team and create. Like I would recommend, you don't need permission to actually be a director, to actually like write your own stories. Like you should go for it and do it. And in fact, Eric, our writer and director, that's actually how he became a director at DreamWorks. Is that he created his own projects, he created his own animations, and that's what he looks for. Are people who don't wait for permission, people who just have to tell stories, they have to do it. And so I would say on that side of the fence, don't wait for permission to actually tell your stories and to have your voice heard.
So that's a great point. Don't wait for anyone, actually. And any permission. This is how also I started and how everything is moving on. Next question.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah, go for it.
Go for it. Don't be shy. Come on.
You have us here now.
Yeah. Okay.
Hello? Why animation? Why you wanted to work in that side of the film?
It's an excellent question. I'm going to let you in on a little secret, which is I was not exposed to animated films growing up. My mom actually did not like animated films, so I actually love performing. So I did acting as a kid. I was not a very good singer, but I was in an a cappella group in college, and so I had this side of me that was creative, and like I really enjoyed that performance side of things. But I also had this degree in computer science, and I love math, and I love everything on the science side of things, and I was much better at that than I was as an actor. But I always viewed those as being like this disparate, these two things that were like two parts of my life that couldn't be combined. I didn't know how I could, so I gravitated towards computer science and computer graphics where I can make pretty pictures. But then all of a sudden there was this place, Pixar, where they were bringing together storytelling and computer science and computer graphics in one roof. And it was like, all of a sudden I watched Toy Story. It's like, oh my God, like there's a place where I can actually do both. But I didn't have that background in or appreciation for animation. And that I actually did develop while I went through my career. So all of a sudden I was watching all like the old animated movies. I was like, wow, this is amazing. What have I been missing? But what really led me into animation was my own passion for wanting to be close to storytelling, and just this opportunity where, from a computer graphics perspective, there are so many interesting challenges to sort of make, whether it's effects work look really cool or a character look believable. That was really exciting to me from a career standpoint. So that's how I ended up in animation. Now I think what's so special about animation, I love live action. I've actually made a lot of live action shorts, just for fun. And I love cameras and photography, and so I would secretly love to be a cinematographer, or an editor. I love editing too. And so, but what's so special about animation is that you can completely take people to brand new worlds that are only in the only restricted by the creativity in people's heads. And so I think that there's something so magical about everything being sort of created from scratch, and the art of animation, how animators approach things is just, there's something really special, especially with the stylization. I think that that's one thing that I've become really passionate about, is not how do we just recreate it. So it could be live action, it could, is it a CG character, or is it a real actor? Hard to tell anymore. But in animation, we have this opportunity to really play with character design and play with the worlds we're creating. So there's no semblance of reality. That's what's special to me.
So animation. I started out as a scriptwriter personally, and I'm in love of telling stories. I'm a storyteller, basically. And then I moved into comics. So my first medium was comics. I write it, I collaborated with a team, we draw them, we publish them, we made some graphic novels, some series, some nice stuff. And then, for the first time, I moved something in stop motion. And, it happened. That moment was a very wow moment in my life, because you give life to an object and it reacts and it moves as you move it. And from that moment, I was like, whoa, I want to get into animation. So I turned, and from that moment on, actually it was 2007, I started being involved in animation. And from recently, 2017, 18, I said, let's make it into the industry, let's make it official. And from that moment on, I'm focused there, and I changed from scriptwriter now to producer, because we are lacking producers. And producers doesn't mean money, guys. No. It means other skills. And we are lacking a lot of that in Greece, because everyone was like, oh, I'm going to be an artist, I'm going to be in animation. But we lack managerial skills also. And it's equally important as all the other skills. That's it.
Another question. I want to see the I have two roles. One as a cultural manager. So my first question is, as animation is a part of the creative and cultural industry field, how do you see that in the future in terms of young professionals being there, having this as the main income from that aspect? And on the other hand, I'm a PhD candidate in the department of mass media journalism here in Thessaloniki. And I want to ask you, as animation is a medium, so you have a message to transfer. How does that content shift throughout the years? And what is your context for the next years? What do you want to pass to the audience?
Right. So I'll start out with the first question. I think there may be two components to it. So one is the cultural component, and then the other is how do you make money? When you say to people who want to be able to have a career. So on the cultural side, this is something that, as an independent studio, we felt really blessed that we could actually pursue this and tell the stories that we wanted to tell. And in fact, a number of those stories really are sort of shining a light on cultures and storytelling that hasn't been done, hasn't gotten their say. So Crow the Legend was the first project that we did that really had a strong cultural component, because it was based off of this Native American tale that had been told for generations orally, for hundreds of years basically. And what's interesting is not the right word, but what is sad about it is that those types of stories in the United States have been really suppressed because basically we came in and not only did we take Native Americans' lands, we also sent young kids to re-education schools to become better Christians, and unfortunately, like, we basically suppressed their storytelling, their way of life, and so those stories, like Crow the Legend, are not heard, even like certainly outside of the Native American communities, and so Eric loved that story from the very moment we started our company. It's a story of how the crow becomes the crow. And in this world, the crow has these beautiful feathers. He looks nothing like the crow that we know. And when winter comes, they have to send the crow off because they're scared they're going to freeze to death to bring back warmth. And he ends up being given fire. And he ends up, in order to save the world, he kind of chars his feathers and destroys what he thinks is beautiful for him. But then what he realizes is that he's iridescent, and so it's the beauty is on the inside. And so we just love that theme. And so what we did is we partnered with Native American communities and leaders. So the CEO at the time, Sarah Eaglehart for Native Americans and Philanthropy, was an executive producer. Randy Edmond was our narrator, who is like an elder statesman and advocate for Native American rights. And so we really wanted to make sure that we wouldn't misappropriate the story, and at the same time we wanted it to be something that could actually shine a spotlight on these types of stories and sort of give voice to indigenous worldviews. And what was great is we brought in an amazing cast. So we had like John Legend was the crow. We had Oprah Winfrey. We had Constance Wu. Just a really all-star cast. They all wanted to work on this project. We couldn't pay them a lot of money, but they wanted to work on this project because they believed in it, and they also wanted to shine a spotlight on it. So, like, we really have an opportunity to actually tell stories that have cultural significance, and so that's a really important part of kind of our journey and the types of stories that we tell. So the second part is, and then there's the third part. The second part is how can young professionals make a living? And that's one of the things that's been great is that the animation industry has been thriving over the last 20 or 30 years. And there are lots of opportunities to have a career in animation and have it be well paying. And not just if you work at Disney, which is, up until 20, 25 years ago, that was primarily, like where most of the animators, like where you can really have a career. But now there's so many different ways, and animation has permeated so many different parts of your life. And there's so many more opportunities for independent animators, for small companies. So I do think that is a viable career choice for people, and not just in the United States, but here in Greece and elsewhere. So I'm definitely bullish on that. And then, what was your second question? I'm so sorry.
Animation is a medium.
Oh, right.
So, what about the content?
How do we come up with our stories and the message?
The audience development throughout the years, how do you get affected, let's say, by social factors? Perhaps, let's mention inclusive, how inclusive you are building a character.
Yeah, so in all honesty, the way that our stories and our messages and our characters are developed is actually, as I said before, everything starts with the story. So, and we're often working on something for, let's say, a year, or if it's an animated film, it might be 3 to 5 years. So you can't be like beholden to whatever the latest trends are. it really has to be like, we have this overarching story that we want to tell. And one of the first things that you're defining is, what is the message? Like, what am I trying to say? And hopefully that message has resonance, and hopefully, let's say it has a message of inclusivity, or, like with Crow as an example, one of the key messages that we wanted to tell, which wasn't necessarily part of the original story, was that diversity is what makes us stronger. And so that message was really important to us because it actually fit within the story. It was our perspective on the story that we were telling. And so that kind of permeated everything that we were doing from the cast. Our cast was almost predominantly, non-white cast. So that was really important to us, of who we cast. But all of that, it wasn't because diversity was like as we rolled that out, suddenly like diversity in entertainment became a big thing. It was the hot topic. But that was something that we really had, is first of all really important to our company, but it was really important to that project. And so I do think you always start with the story and how the director interprets the message that you want to tell and the themes that you want to tell. And then you hope that those themes resonate with the audience when you tell them. And you are right, sometimes what could be resonant when you start a project could actually be quite different than when you finish a project. And that is one of the challenges that you have that is a little bit out of your control. But we typically don't start with like, this is what's hot, because by the time we actually finish a project, it's no longer hot. So it really starts with the story first.
To conclude, I would like to say that there is a very big fortunate thing that happened for animation, was COVID. It was the only productions that never stopped during the pandemic. Everyone just moved towards their houses and continued producing, although everything else stopped. So the value and the need for animation grow a lot. So content is asking constantly for all audiences, from adult to preschool to anything. Keep in mind that also a big business difference, is that when you animate for children, preschool, your audience changes every 3 years. So every 3 years you have new audience for your series and films. Children for every 6 to 7 years. In the contrary to adults, it's far more above. And my studio started with originals also, wanting to say our stories. Although we are in other productions, part of other productions. And basically, to answer the second question you asked, is that animation was always a medium that is free. You can go above and say stuff because you can use any fantastic environment or character or everything, and you can symbolize or touch issues that you cannot touch with live action. So I would say that as artist or as storyteller, you are obligated to go beyond and not to hit the trends, but go even further, or to provoke and show some solutions or some ideas to what you would like to be as a society. And of course, inclusiveness and political correctness and all of that is something that we are dealing now. But as an artist or storyteller, you think where you want to end up. So this is how you treat it. I think that concludes everything.
Any other questions?
I thought we don't have any time for any other questions.
No. So, please give a great applause to Larry.
Σας ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ για την παρουσία σας σήμερα. Να ξέρετε ότι οι βεβαιώσεις συμμετοχής για όσους έχετε στείλει email για τις προσκλήσεις θα είναι έτοιμες και θα σας σταλούν στο email σας προσεχώς.
Όσοι δεν το έχετε κάνει και παρακολουθήσατε το Masterclass, μπορείτε να στείλετε email στο filmoffice@pkm.gov.gr για να πάρετε την βεβαίωσή σας. Σας ευχαριστούμε πολύ. Ένα μεγάλο χειροκρότημα για τον Λάρη και για τους ομιλητές μας.